Hi guys, Jenica here from Multispective, and I'm here to share with you a brand new episode. In this episode, I interview Rita Bliven. She talks about her childhood where she was being raised amongst very unhealthy household. Her parents were undergoing quite a messy divorce, and she was taken away from her mother's house to her father's house, and then several years down back home to her mother's place. And in that process, she was having a lot of sort of identity crisis. She had a difficult time belonging, feeling loved, and she felt a great sense of neglect. She ended up being very inward, very introverted, and spent a lot of her time just processing her own life on her own, feeling really alone throughout her journey. So she talks about this concept of attachment and the different types of attachment styles that exist. She herself lived for a very long time with avoidant attachment style. So we delve really deep into that, what that entails, what that means, and we talk about the other types of healthy and unhealthy attachments. This is something that's relatable to anyone that's listening. We all have a different type of attachment style, and in this episode we talk about how your upbringing can affect it, what are the signs of a certain type of attachment style, what triggers it, and what can we do to have a secure and healthier form of attachment. So tune in, listen, drop a comment, drop a like, and let us know what you think. Really, really excited for you guys to hear it, and I hope you guys enjoy it and learn something from this. Rita, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, your childhood, where are you from?
Okay, so it all starts with the childhood. That's a heavy question. So I come from, a mother from the United States and a father that was an immigrant from Mexico. And my mom was from Pennsylvania, and she moved to California for work and met my father, and they fell in love and had me and got married. But unfortunately, the marriage dissolved very quickly. And my father, it was the 80s, and my father was afraid he wouldn't have any custody rights against a full-blown citizen. So out of fear, he fled to Mexico and took me with him and severed all ties with my mom and her side of the family. And I spent the next 2 years in Mexico. And even though I am an American citizen, my first language was Spanish, and I bonded with my father and his side of the family. And then when I was 3 years old, my mom got me back. So very early on, I didn't have any stability, and anyone that I bonded with, I was separated from. So as a baby, I bonded with my mother, and then I was separated from her by my father. And then I bonded with my father and his side of the family, and I was separated from them when my mother got me back. So my earliest memories are of being in a new country with people that didn't speak my language, in a family that, even though they were my family, my biological family, I had no connection or memory with them. And so that was the beginning of my life, and that is why I am so interested in attachment theory, because attachment theory really explains how those happenings can affect an individual and future relationships.
Wow, and there's so much to unpack here. Really, really interesting. But of course, you are very, very young at this point, so you don't have a say or decision making with regards what is in the best interest of you at that moment. And obviously, to an extent, it makes sense maybe why your dad did what he did. He wanted to keep you close, but your mom as well. And it's a battle of the adults, and then the kids end up getting involved. What about your siblings at the time? What was going on with them?
So I have kind of an interesting story. So my mom has actually been married 4 times. And so when I was born, she already had a son, my older brother, from her previous marriage. Technically, we're half brother and sister, but pretty much my mother's children are my siblings. They're the siblings that I grew up with. So my brother was actually shipped back to Pennsylvania with to be raised by my grandparents, while my mom for 2 years tried to get me back. And then when she got me back, she went to Pennsylvania, and then me and my older brother grew up together. And then my mom married again, and 8 years later I had my sister, and then 2 years later I had my younger brother. So we're all half siblings. We have different fathers. Well, my two youngest siblings have the same father, but we consider each other, full siblings. And so my older brother was very much so affected by the situation as well. But he had such a strong bond with our grandparents that he just bonded with them, and so he has a very healthy attachment considering he was separated from our mother. He's coped in a more healthy way than I did.
Yeah. I wonder whether this could be somewhat gender based. Is it possible as well?
I think it's certainly possible, but I also think that, even though my brother was separated from my mother, he was a little bit older, and it was explained to him, because he's 3 years older than me. And if you get into the true attachment theory, it's believed that attachment is really from 6 months old until 2 years old. And so he was a little bit older than that when he was shipped to my grandparents. So he had already established a lasting bond with my mother, and it was explained to him, and he understood more than a baby would. He was still very young, but he was with my grandparents temporarily, and then they still talked with my mother. They still had phone calls, and so that attachment was still nurtured from a distance, but still nurtured nonetheless, whereas I was completely separated every time. When my father took me to Mexico, it was what's considered an international parental kidnapping. He had no contact with my mother or her family, and I had no contact with them. And then when my mother got me back, she was afraid that he would do it again. And so she went to great lengths to separate me from my father. She even changed my name.
Wow.
And so there was the connection was truly severed in my case. Whereas my older brother, it was a temporary thing during formative years, so it can still be traumatic, but it wasn't as complete of a separation, and there was still contact. And so I think it's more so about that rather than gender, but gender could perhaps play a little bit of a part as well.
Yeah. No, I hear you in the sense that with your situation, it was indefinitely, at least until the point you knew. So there was no point of return. There was no plan for return at that point. And even if there was at that point, you were too young to understand that. But that was sort of like the narrative at the time. So when you were being taken by your dad, you were not being told that you're going to go back to mom, right? I'm curious, though, as to how did this all roll out? I mean, was the divorce between your mom and dad really bad? Is that why he had to basically kidnap you?
It was, yes, it was. So my father, and he's totally recovered now, but he did get involved in drugs and alcohol, and in his intoxicated state at times would get violent with my mother. And so I'm sure there was some strong language at the time that my mom used, like, we need to get away from you, or you're not safe. And so, he began to fear not having access to me at all. Now, that was never my mother's intent. And there's also cultural differences, that, not to stereotype too much, but I'm sure as a Mexican man, he didn't like being limited at all from his child. And he really did not want a divorce. My mom had made the healthy decision to divorce my father because, like I said, he had gotten abusive and was, involved in drugs and alcohol. So it was a healthy decision for my mother, but he did not want a divorce. So you have a person in the midst of addiction in from a more conservative culture being told we're getting a divorce, and you're maybe not the safest person to have full custody of our daughter. Right. And so there's all of that.
Yeah. Do you reckon if your parents had stayed together and you remained in a violent or abusive with an alcoholic father sort of environment, that your attachment style would be quite different from the way it turned out? Do you attest basically most of your attachment style development to the fact that they got separated, or is some of it also sort of stemmed back into sort of the way the household was before they separated even?
That's a fantastic question. And I would tend to think that it's all encompassing. So, I mean, when you really, I know it's strange for the average person to think that what happens when a baby's in the womb or in the very infant stages of their lives would have an impact, because, you know, what's the age-old saying is, well, the child doesn't even remember that. Well, our nervous system remembers. Now, we don't have words to articulate, and we can't. It's not the subconscious mind that is affected. It's the conscious mind. It's the subconscious mind that's affected. So I do think that the turmoil, because pretty much their marriage fell apart almost immediately after I was born. So I do think the turmoil. I mean, even just the stress of my mother. You know, she's nursing, and you know, and was in stress, and so I think all of it is encompassing to an unhealthy attachment style. I do think that my father taking me to Mexico caused me to have an avoidant attachment style. So generally speaking, there is healthy attachment and unhealthy attachment. And then within unhealthy attachment, there are subcategories. And I think most likely, if my mom and dad stayed together and he was an alcoholic and abusive, I may actually have had an anxious attachment style, which is still unhealthy, but is a little different. Whereas because I was separated, I developed more of an avoidant attachment style.
Interesting.
And it's pretty intricate. I mean, it gets into all sorts of areas. But yes, I think the avoidant attachment was developed because of the extreme separations.
Interesting. Okay, so let's dig a little bit into the attachment styles so our listeners can understand this a bit better, and then I want to definitely go back into the story from that point on. So you mentioned there's two umbrella attachment styles, one being the healthy, one being the unhealthy. You may call it secure and insecure. So the secure one being raised by, you know, a very loving, attentive, caring, present set of parents, and the unhealthy, there's a couple of subcategories. I think there's 3, if I'm not mistaken. Well, there's the anxious, the avoidant, but even within that, there's more layers to it. Tell us a little bit about those unhealthy styles.
Sure, absolutely. So I have to give credit to, I think it's Mary Ainsworth. So attachment theory was first developed by a doctor, Bowlby, I think is his name, and he published a paper in 1958, and then Mary Ainsworth developed upon his theory and really identified the different attachment styles. So have to give credit where credit's due. So secure attachment, the main theory, and I think this is so amazing, is that a child really only needs one primary caregiver. Now, of course, the ideal is 2 loving, present, attentive caregivers. I mean, it takes 2 people to create a human. Yeah. So I think that that's a reflection of that best, you know, most ideal, perfect situation. But our Creator, in His infinite wisdom, made it so that we really only need one. And I was just thinking about this the other day. He gives us 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 hands, 2 legs. And so that we can still function, we can still see if something happens to one of our eyes. Is it the most ideal? No. But thank God we can still function with one. And so attachment theory, the major principle is that a child needs to develop a lasting bond with at least one primary caregiver that's attentive and loving and all of that. And from that, there is a foundation of security. And then from that foundation of security, the child is free to explore, to ask questions, and to develop, mainly. Then you get into the insecure attachment styles. The 3 major causes of insecure attachment are abuse, neglect, and then separation. Separation is the one that's not highlighted as often. So most people are aware that if you're abused or neglected, you're probably going to have some developmental challenges. Very few people really associate separation, extreme separation. I mean, of course, if your caregiver goes to the grocery store and comes back. That doesn't count. But, you know, extreme separation, kind of how we already talked about in my story. Most people don't equate that with developmental issues, but it's very much a real thing. And sometimes it's because of death or illness. You know, if there's an extreme illness and let's say a mother that bonded with the child is going through chemotherapy and in the hospital, that's still a prolonged dramatic and traumatic separation. So there's all sorts of scenarios that create the separation, but it's more than just going to the grocery store and coming back, or going to work and coming back. It's a more extreme separation. So then, to answer your question, the three major types of insecure attachment are anxious attachment, and I think the name really says a lot. So an anxious attachment, a person dealing with extreme anxious attachment is going to be very aware that their needs aren't met and be anxious to get them met. So they're the person that in a relationship says, you don't pay me enough attention, you don't listen to me, pay me attention, you know, and they're anxious to get their needs met. Then there's avoidant attachment, and they're the kind of the opposite. They believe, I can't even depend on you people to meet my needs, so I'm going to meet my own needs. And so they're avoidant. They're avoidant with other people. They're like, I don't need you to meet my needs. I meet my own needs. And so that presents relational problems in different ways. And then the third one is what's called disorganized, and it's a combination of the two. And the third one is the most rare. And it's funny to me because technically we all do both. We all have moments of being anxious about getting our needs met. And we all have moments of being avoidant and saying, I can't even expect anything from you people. I'm just going to take care of myself. We all have those moments. But the anxious attachment person, it's going to be a reoccurring theme in their life. And the avoidant person, it's going to be a reoccurring theme in their life. And so that's what makes it so interesting about the disorganized, because the disorganized may sound healthy because sometimes they're anxious and sometimes they're avoidant. They may sound healthy, but it has more to do with extremes. You know, a secure person might say, well, you know what? My husband's been working a lot, and my husband's been dealing with some other major issue, like maybe his mom is sick, and I haven't been getting the attention that he normally gives me, and I need to express that, and I'm feeling a little down because of that. The disorganized is going to be more dramatic and more and feel more threatened in the changing circumstance, both in an avoidant way and in an anxious way. So it swings more dramatically. And so that's the difference between disorganized and a secure attachment, because they both do both, but it's the extremes, and then also the risky behavior. So an avoidant, a secure person will say, I'm not getting my needs met, let's have a rational conversation, let me articulate that. Whereas someone in the unhealthy category may engage in risky behaviors, like I'm calling off work today so that we can talk, so that I can get my needs met. And then, you can't do that all the time. Maybe once a year, you can do that. But if you're constantly, not functioning because of your anxiety about getting your needs met or because of extreme avoidance, that's a sign that it's not healthy.
So you say that you were more avoidant attachment, right?
Yes.
So yours was in relation to the separation, although you do say that you still had one parent at the time, and the losing of another parent still kind of caused this. Was it also to an extent because your father wasn't, even though he had taken you away, you didn't feel like he was as present, or you didn't feel that sense of security that I still have a guardian, a caretaker present and there for me?
So that's an interesting question, because I don't have any memories of being in Mexico. I don't have any memories of the separations. So I was 3 years old when my mom got me back, and then raised by her and her family. And my earliest memories are from around the age of 3. Now, I remember not speaking English. I remember being around people that didn't speak my language and having to zone in on people's lips. I still do that today. It's kind of a bad habit. and I would repeat things back in my head that people said over and over again to try to grasp the meaning. And so I remember learning English and losing Spanish. So a child under the age of 8 can pick up or lose a language just by the people speaking around them. So when my mom took me back to Pennsylvania, no one spoke Spanish. My mom spoke a little bit of Spanish just from being married to my dad, and she later became a Spanish teacher, which is so funny. But she didn't conversate with anybody in my presence, and because nobody else spoke Spanish. And so she would speak to me some in Spanish, but I basically lost Spanish pretty quickly and gained English pretty quickly. But that was sort of how my mind as a 3-year-old understood that a separation had taken place and that I was in a new place, even though I have no actual memory of being separated from my mother as a baby and then being separated from my father as a toddler. I have no actual memory. Now, part of my healing journey is reconnecting with my father. So what I have surmised is that my father and his family are just the stereotypical, huge, loving Hispanic family. My dad is one of 11. And so I had a lot of caregivers, not just my grandmother, but my great-grandmother, my dad's sisters, and then my dad. And so I think that no one will ever know for sure, but my guess is that had my father taken me from my mother, and then I stayed in Mexico, I think I would probably have a pretty secure attachment. Because there was so much love and so many caregivers, and my father was present. And it doesn't have to be mother or father. It could be grandparent or aunt. But I had so much love and so much security in my huge family. I think I probably would have been fine. Not to say that my father's better than my mother. That's not the issue. It's just that the foundation of love was strong, and true attachment happens, like I said, from 6 months old to 2 years old. And so I was pretty much in the same place for that time period. My dad took me to Mexico when I was a baby, and my mom got me back when I was 3. So from the truly attachment developmental age range, I was in the same place with the same people that were all very loving. And so I think I probably would have been okay. I would have been alienated from my country and my mother, and that as I cognitively understood that may have caused some other issues, but I think my attachment would have been more secure.
Interesting.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so you were basically just sort of at the cusp of basically developing that attachment style and securing that attachment style, whatever it be. And then that move was sort of like throwing you right in the midst of it again. And now you're in this new environment, possibly also in a loving environment with your mom, but just in this absolutely unknown place, feeling super foreign, and sort of just, being back in the throes of it. What was it like being raised by your mom thereafter? I know the language barriers, but in other aspects, how was your relationship with your mom and your mom's side of the family?
So good, ultimately. So my mom is also from a large family by American standards. She's one of 5. And her parents had a 100-acre farm, and they gave all their kids land on the farm. So I grew up with lots of aunts and uncles and cousins and my grandparents. And then my mom remarried to my stepfather, whose family lived a mile down the road. And so his family was also very loving and present. And so I think that was a huge, huge blessing. But what happened is that I knew I was loved and I knew I was supported, but I had difficulty feeling loved, and I felt very alienated. And I looked different. So, my mom, like I said, was married 4 times, and my brother's father and then my 2 younger siblings' father were both white. And so my brothers and sisters are blonde-haired and blue-eyed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I have more Mexican features, and it's February here right now, so I don't have any tan, but I get pretty dark.
Right.
I live here in North Carolina, so I'm tan most of the year.
Right.
And I have darker hair and just darker features. So I very much stood out in family pictures. And then just with the language, um, even though I learned English very quickly, it was still very much in my recent memory that I had this extra struggle that my siblings and cousins didn't have, and then it was validated by my feelings that I know logically these people love me, and I know logically that this is my mom and that I belong here, but I don't feel like I do, and I have trouble feeling their love. Now, the major exception to all of that is my grandmother, my mom's mom. For whatever reason, I bonded with her very quickly, and so I wasn't completely alienated from love, but just generally speaking, considering that I was in my mother's house, surrounded by my mother's family, that's generally loving, I did not attach like a normal child would have. But I did have, I say precursors to healing, like with my relationship with my grandmother, and then later with my younger sister.
You were very much welcome by both family members, but I also find it very interesting that you have repeatedly said that you in a way were kind of justifying the fact that you were being loved. I was being loved. I knew it logically, practically. I knew it, but I didn't feel it. But I knew it, but I didn't feel it. So I'm curious as to what's kind of like inciting this sort of inner little battle, this inner dialogue.
Yeah, so I will say it's not good. When you're a child, there are already innate insecurities. I mean, my goodness, the adolescent years, there are innate insecurities. But to add broken attachment in the mix is, it just creates a lot of confusion and a lot of anxiety. So I will say I also suffered from depression and anxiety, which is interesting because, you can have avoidant attachment, not anxious attachment, but yet still suffer from anxiety,
Right.
which is different from anxious attachment. And so, I had trouble receiving love. I had a hard time knowing my sense of self or purpose, and I feared intimacy. Anytime anybody got too close, I felt extremely uncomfortable. But at the same time, I suffered from anxiety. I'm still a little jittery, as you have seen on this podcast. But I was very jittery. I mean, it was like a physical anxiety. And then, from a very young age, I mean, I think my youngest memory of being down or depressed was in first grade. So, I mean, I suffered from depression, and it makes sense because, secure attachment really is all about love. It says, I am loved and protected and cared for, and so then I'm free to develop. And so even if you're loved and you should have that foundation of love, if for whatever reason you don't, then you don't have the foundation of life. I mean, it's kind of funny, but and I know not everyone that's physically intimate is in love, but it's kind of funny that life starts from lovemaking, and so how much more does the development of a person need to start from a foundation of love? And so even though I was loved, I didn't have that foundation of love. And so I was just unsure about everything. I mean, and then also, I didn't look like my family. And I do think there is just an innate belonging when you look like the people that you're growing up with.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like, I may not know what I'm going to be when I grow up, but I know that I have my mom's jawbone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, for a child, that's important to say, well, I may not know this or that about the future or about adulthood or about real life, but I know who I am in my family. And I basically didn't have that. I knew that I was the one that looked different, that talked different, that wasn't there when I was a baby. And even though I couldn't articulate that, I felt it. And so then I also just felt completely confused about so many other aspects of life.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember, being asked a question and it would just be immediate chaos within myself. It would just be immediately like, well, I think this sometimes and I think that sometimes. I don't know which one to say. And so, and that's, I mean, we've all had that some, but I had that a lot.
Yeah.
I didn't know how to express myself.
So do you think that, and again, this could be a chicken and an egg, which one comes first, or do they just come in hand? But do you think that attachment styles can have something to do with self-identity too?
Oh, absolutely. And so, we do not know who we are when we're born. We look to our caregivers to not clone. I mean, we don't say I'm going to be exactly like my caregiver. But let's face it, how many people do you know that are that the apple doesn't far from the tree? Wow, she looks like her mom, she talks like her mom, she's similar in personality. And so it's not that it has to happen that way, but we do glean certain characteristics from our primary caregivers and or respond, even if we don't necessarily emulate them. We respond in some way, like, mom's very caring, and so I'm caring in a different way, but caring nonetheless. Or, my dad's very talkative and he likes to talk about sports. Well, I'm talkative about politics, or whatever, but we emulate our primary caregivers on some level. And, there's the whole debate, nature versus nurture. And so, some of the argument is, well, just genetically certain traits are passed on. And I do think that's true, but I also think that nurture is a big part of it. And so, when your primary caregivers are around you, nurturing certain characteristics, we develop our personalities. And I know, there's all sorts of science where, a child is adopted and they never knew their biological parents, but then they meet their biological parents and they're exactly like them. And so that's really a case for nature. And then the opposite can be said where there are twins and one twin is raised by the biological parents and another twin is for whatever reason separated and raised by a different family, and they later on meet and they're completely different. Completely, clearly their upbringing had a bigger effect on their personality than their genetics. And so that's a case for nurture. And so we don't know the exact science, it's not an exact science, but pretty much anybody can say, yes, the people that raise you help form your identity on some level. And so, but there has to be that foundation of love for you to be able to process all of that. And so I was not able to process all of that. So I just sort of lived in a state of uneasiness and confusion.
Interesting. Was that, would you say, in any way perpetuated by your surroundings, like in school as well, or your teachers? Did they sort of like enhance or make that confusion even a bit stronger for you in a way?
Absolutely. So I ended up in Western Pennsylvania in the 80s. And there were no Mexicans or people of color. I mean, in my elementary school, I was the not white kid. You know what I mean? And I really wasn't, I don't think I was ever bullied for race, but I think that it was easy to pick on me because I was different, if that makes sense. I don't ever remember any slurs or anything, but I was also like a bull in a china shop. I was also dealing with a lot of confusion and anxiety, and so I probably didn't behave like a normal child. And so I wouldn't say I was like viciously bullied, but I was a little bit bullied in elementary school, so that certainly perpetuated it. And then also, I will just say that, my birth name is Margarita. And part of my mom's effort to protect me from my father's kidnapping again was she changed my name. So my name got legally changed to Rita. And then my stepdad adopted me and my older brother, so we took his last name. So when I was born, I was Margarita Perez. And then, when I was 5 years old, my name got changed to Rita Callan. And so, but it wasn't in time for school registration. And so the name Margarita was always announced the first day of school.
Right.
And in Western Pennsylvania in the 80s, that was shocking.
Right.
That was shocking information. And then I would say, well, no, it's been legally changed to Rita. And then, of course, first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade. What do you mean your name's been legally changed? My name's never been legally changed. Who changes their name? And so there was just always conversation around all of that. And at times I felt very good explaining. At times it was like, well, this is my story and it's different from yours. And I guess you could say at times I liked being unique. And then at other times it was like, I have to explain this again, and it's not the most, positive story. You know what I mean? And I certainly didn't explain it like I do now. I explained it, through the eyes of a child. But, sometimes I enjoyed that and sometimes I didn't.
Yeah. And typically for a person that's avoidant attached, generally tend to sort of rely on themselves. Like you mentioned earlier, they don't believe that there's anyone else necessarily they can fall back on. So what did it look like for you? Like what did, avoidant attachment look like for you personally, for Rita?
Yeah. So I think there's a healthy response and an unhealthy response. So before I had any therapy, I had a little bit of both. So my unhealthy response was that I lived in my own little world. And I know there are some imaginative personalities who do that, and it's not necessarily an unhealthy thing. It's who they are. They're the poets and the beautiful authors that create all these great works of literature for us to enjoy. That's not my natural personality. I'm more deliberate. I'm a planner. I'm very aware. In my more healthy state, I am not a whimsical dreamer. You know what I mean? It was more of a trauma response that I just lived in my own little world and had my own imaginations and just was really out of touch with reality in a sense. Now, not to the point where I was, I didn't believe I could fly or anything like that, but I certainly had my own I'm sure you've met people like that who just, the dreamer who's just inward and who just has their own their little world. I don't know how else to say it. That was probably the unhealthy response. The more healthy response is that, my grandmother was very much a Bible-thumping Christian, and she introduced me to God. And so, if you're not so sure about your earthly surroundings, it's a little bit easier to accept the idea of God. And so I very much delved into God. And I think that part, and I'm grateful for that part. I'm grateful that I was able to just be receptive. And then also I had a need, because the idea was, this world's messed up, but be of good cheer. We have a God that overcame the world, so rely on him. And for me, that was very comforting because I sensed my world was messed up. I sensed that, my parents had a dramatic divorce and I was, living the consequences of that. And I didn't have a secure sense of self or a secure foundation of love. So I was very relieved that in the idea that there's an all-powerful God who wants to assist me. And so I, delved into my faith, and it's still a huge part of my life today. And so I think that is a silver lining in the whole scenario. And then my escapism was something I had to work through.
Right.
And I probably should add that, my mom's family is great. I love them. They're wonderful. But, and you're not in America. Where are you?
I'm actually in China, Shanghai.
Oh, you're in China.
Yeah,
oh my
the
gosh.
other side of the world.
That is so cool. But where are you originally from? You don't look like you're originally from China.
I was actually born in Hong Kong, but my ethnicity is Indian. I'm Indian. Yeah,
Okay, all right.
brown.
I
Yeah.
love Indian food.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming most people in the world are aware of this. I don't know. I'm not that culturally aware, but in the 90s, my mom's family was very much just like your typical loving but socially acceptable dysfunctional family. Kind of like,
Okay.
are you aware of
Yeah.
this? Are you parts of the world aware of
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if this was, common around the
Yeah.
world. So,
Very much in the
do you know
East.
that yes. So do you know the Roseanne Barr show?
Rosie and Basho. No.
Roseanne Barr.
Rosie and
Anyway, it
Bar.
was a big show.
Yep.
It was a big show here in the 90s, and it sort of normalized, the middle class, socially acceptable dysfunction
Right.
in a family. And I very much relate to that show when it
Right.
comes to my mother's side of the family. There's just sort of, you know, even though they're all very close, they're a little bit critical of each other in a, loud, northern, socially acceptable kind of
Yeah.
way. I don't know how else to say it. I know I'm probably hitting on a lot of stereotypes, but it's true. I'm just trying to paint the
Yeah.
picture that, that it's true. And then just to add a little bit of backstory, I don't think that my mom's family really fostered the best attachment, just even apart from my situation with going to Mexico. So, and this is actually very prevalent with immigrant families. So my grandfather was first generation American. His father, came through Ellis Island from Slovenia. And his mother actually came to the United States as an indentured servant, which is just wild for us to think about. And I actually knew her. She didn't die until I was like 8, 9, 10 years old. And so there's this idea, that we have to make it in this country. Your feelings don't matter. We have to survive. And, kids are expected to not be kids and to be mature and work at a very young age, and also put their feelings aside to create this new legacy in this new country. Because, my great-grandparents left Slovenia because they didn't have a hope or a future in Slovenia, and so they came to the United States, and it was with very limited resources, trying to establish a new life and a new legacy. And so there's also that pressure of, we don't want a bad reputation, because reputation is everything to an immigrant who has nothing.
Right.
And so that was my grandfather's upbringing, and then he got married to my grandmother, and they bought a 100-acre farm out in the country. And so some of that was still prevalent, but then also it was, we have this farm.
Right.
And my mom and my aunts and uncle talk about really hard farm work at a very young age. And so attachment was just not center stage in my mom's family. So, there's the argument that, maybe if I had been, taken from Mexico and put in a family that had a really secure or strong attachment within the family, maybe I would have just adapted and just naturally, created new bonds and gone on with my life. But I think because I had a traumatic experience, and then I, entered into a family that doesn't necessarily have the best attachment. We all love each other. It's great.
Yeah.
But they will admit themselves that there are some, socially acceptable dysfunctions, and that attachment isn't necessarily my mom's family's strong suit. It just wasn't the environment to recover from damaged attachment.
Definitely.
And then I was introduced to, like I said, a loving God, and so that was just the more natural choice, in a sense. Yeah.
That makes sense. Talk to me about boundaries. How does boundaries play a part in something like this?
Totally messed up. So avoidants have extreme, excessive boundaries. Their default is almost always no. I mean, their default is no. Do you want to go out? No. Can I come over? No. It's a default, and I really describe avoidant attachment as this internal fortress, kind of like the old timey cities that had fortified walls around them to protect from outside invasion. It's like that, except internal and unnecessary. Even when you're safe, you feel like you're not safe, and so the default is no. And so in society, you might be praised because you might be praised for having really good boundaries. Like I was never that girl that dated the bad boy. You know what I mean? And so that was very much so praised. On the flip side, anxious attachment really dishonors their own boundaries and other people's boundaries because, like I said, they're so desperate to get their needs met that you might say, in a dating relationship, for example, no, you can't come over right now. I need to get to bed early. I have a big day tomorrow. And they're like, well, I need to get my needs met, so I'm coming over even uninvited, And so those boundaries, they're willing to push past boundaries for their needs to be met. And so boundaries are definitely not a strong suit for somebody dealing with an unhealthy attachment style. Now, have we all had times in our lives where we've defaulted to no, or maybe disrespected our boundaries or the people that we love's boundaries? Yes. But again, it's a reoccurring theme with someone who's truly on the unhealthy side.
Right. So oftentimes when we're talking about this, it's more like when it's sort of getting in the way of like your general sort of like lifestyle, right?
Yes.
What about
Yes.
like boundaries when you were young, being raised by your mom? Would you say like, would you say like maybe they were overstepping boundaries to an extent? This is before you had the opportunity to say no. It was more like being projected onto you. And that's what put those walls up that made you start saying no to everyone else. Would you say that over critiquing and criticizing and just being in on your business is what resulted in this?
Yes, and I will say, like I said, I grew up on pretty much a 100-acre farm with tons of aunts and uncles, and it was great. As a kid, I could, go to my aunt's house where my cousins were, or I could, I could roam the hills, it was great. But at the same time, there weren't the best boundaries established between the adults in my life. So I can't tell you how many times it would play out that my mom and one of her sisters would get super close and spend a whole lot of time together, which meant their kids spent a lot of time together, and then they would get on each other's nerves or have a sister fight, and then kind of just not hang out so much, and my mom would hang out with another sister. And so those were, sloppy boundaries, I would say.
Yeah.
And so I would be exhausted by it. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, that is extremely exhausting. And so that made me shut down a little bit more.
Right. When you're in your childhood and your formative years being raised by your parents, when the boundaries are definitely that foundation of love that you talked about earlier as well, but that boundary not being, sort of set right at the very beginning, not making those boundaries clear, not allowing the other person to be like, you're allowed to say no when you feel uncomfortable. When that's not set strong when you're young, it can lead to avoidant or anxious. It could lead to any sort of attachment style, unhealthy attachment styles, right?
Yeah, for sure. And you kind of touch on another point. So I would say that my mom's family, she was parented this way, and then she parented this way. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the authoritative parenting style, where the authority is the ultimate rule and kids are not to question and not to say no. And that's not the healthiest parenting style just anyway, but especially if there are sloppy boundaries, and especially if you're dealing with some failed attachment, it can irritate certain issues.
Right.
And so, that's sort of what I was kind of alluding to with the whole immigrant family, is there's very much most immigrant families have an authoritative parenting style. I shouldn't say most families. We hear about a lot of immigrant families having that for the first couple generations. because again, it's not about the individual, it's about the family surviving, and there needs to
For sure.
be, it needs to be about work, it needs to be about legacy. And so there's not the freedom to say, well, I'm having a bad day.
Definitely.
And I don't want to bale this hay
Yeah.
today. There's not that
Yeah.
freedom. And so it creates a whole nother slew of issues. Yeah.
No, that's definitely 100% true in the East as well. Here in Asia, that is also a bit of an issue because the whole concept of like family over the self is still very prevalent. So you do have a lot of individuals that were raised very close families, and there's definitely just to that. However, on the flip side, there are also a lot of people who struggle to say no in their adult lives, and they find themselves working and, working really hard, unfair hours, underpaid, and they don't know how to say no to their boss because they were taught from a young age just deferred authority. And so maybe the response is a little bit different. I don't know whether that is necessarily related to avoidant attachment or anxious attachment, but the underlying sort of upbringing is similar in that you defer to authority, and that sort of carries forward all the way through.
Yeah.
But I'm curious. So a person that has developed a certain style of attachment, an unhealthy style, can that be changed, and how?
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that's the $1 million question. So, when I was diagnosed in the 90s, I think the term was considered avoidant attachment disorder. And that language has completely changed. Now it's just an extreme avoidant attachment style or an attachment issue because the mental health industry has realized you can very much so change. And so that is where that's the whole reason I want to share my story. I don't want to share my story because wow, it's an interesting story. I want to share my story because you can change. You're not relegated to your upbringing. You're not relegated to what happened to you. You can develop tools to have a healthier attachment. And so, just like anything, the first step is awareness. So, you do need to, learn about attachment, and you do need to learn about the different attachment styles and determine which style you have. So that's the first step. Kind of like in AA, they say the first step is saying, well, I am an alcoholic. It's the first step. Well, I do understand what attachment is, and I am whatever the case may be. So that's definitely the first step no matter what. It's a little different if you have avoidant versus anxious attachment. So I did not know this when I was going through it. I did not know it. And this is, again, I have to point back to my faith because I really do think it was God. Now that I know more about attachment healing or attachment recovery or trauma recovery, however you wanted to say it, I almost perfectly matched the steps of healing like a textbook, but I didn't know it at the time. I was just, engaging my faith, and then I was in counseling. I was in professional Christian counseling, but in hindsight, I can see that I went through almost the textbook steps. So, just to kind of back up, learn about it, understand what your issue is, and then it really the first step is really like self-talk and self-awareness. And not because I was dealing with attachment, but just in my faith, I was learning about Christian meditation. I was centering myself, and I was getting in touch with what I was feeling, and then processing it through my faith. But I was centering, and then now I understand, and I totally did not understand this at the time, but I was also resetting my nervous system. So, when you have a trauma, even if you cognitively process and deal with it, your nervous system still holds on to the trauma. And meditation is one of the number one things that deals with that.
Yeah.
I had no idea about that at the time. I was just, working on attachment healing and then also just growing in my faith. And so that was, for me, the first step is just sort of recentering and getting back to myself and realizing when we kind of all have those eternal alarms that are like, wait a minute, no, this isn't healthy, this isn't right. And when you have bad boundaries or an unhealthy attachment, you just sort of ignore those feelings and eventually become out of touch with those feelings. And meditation helps you get back in touch with some of your natural responses that are really good. And so that's very important. And there are other techniques other than meditation, but the main step is the same, where you get back to knowing yourself and and one of the main ways that you know yourself is to respond when you feel something. So that was huge, and then intense counseling, and then a huge part of avoidant attachment is kind of going back in the past. But I actually reconnected with my father and reconnected with my Mexican family. And it's sad because not everybody has the ability to do that, but you can go back in the past in a sense and develop a bond with a safe person and sort of comfort yourself in that I didn't have that as a child, but I have it now. For me, it was very literal. I actually went back and went to Mexico and met my father and met his family and connected. And then with anxious attachment, it's a little bit more about behavior modification. So, the anxious person will feel like, oh my God, this person's about to abandon me. This person didn't like something I said and they're about to abandon me, and I have to make them not abandon me. I have to go after them. And so it's really about behavior modification and saying, this is not a catastrophe. It's okay that people don't like every single thing that I say. And this is just an example. I don't need to react. And if they do abandon me, then they weren't a healthy person to begin with. If they're going to abandon me over something so minute, then they're not good for me anyway. And so it's not reacting. And there is, awareness, learning your style, getting back to, more calming techniques. So meditation could be beneficial, not so much to get in touch with how you feel, because usually people with an anxious attachment are very aware of how they feel. It's that it's a catastrophe, and they need more calming techniques and behavior modification, not to react from a place of fear. So it's a little different, but it kind of makes sense once you understand.
Do you think that
the two?
Self-love, self-respect sort of therapy or affirmations can also help for anxious attachment style individual? Because if they're feeling this fear that someone else is going to leave them, there is a certain sort of void of not loving yourself enough to feel like it's okay. I'm okay on my own without this person if it's not meant to work.
Absolutely. Self-love is huge. And so that's, again, it's the whole thing. So, from a foundation of love, when we say, wow, this caregiver loves me, then we naturally love ourselves. We don't have that foundation. We may act like we love ourselves. We may seem to the outside world that we're very confident, but both the avoidant and the anxious do have issues with self-love. The avoidant is going to be more prone to find their sense of identity and love from achievements. So most avoidant people are, hardworking, independent, have the achievement of buying a house young, have the achievement of running a marathon, have the achievement of being successful in their job, and they're really trying to compensate. So there's a self-love component for the avoidant. It's probably easier to understand that there's a need for self-love with the anxious person, because the anxious attachment person is always trying to get their needs met by others, and they're always afraid that others are going to abandon them. And so, if you can get to a point where, hey, like you said, I'm worthy of love. If this person abandons me, they're not healthy. I don't need to fear that. I can understand that not everyone can meet all of my needs all of the time. I can meet some of my needs. And so, I can, go for a walk by myself and, have the endorphin release from walking and, sort of meet myself there. And so, yes, self-love is very important for both recoveries.
Because we do seem
Yeah.
to currently live in this uh, age right now where very, very young individuals are crazy overachievers. You know, you've got those super
Mhm.
influencers, right? Like
Yep.
that have this
Yep.
amazing personality online and are making a lot of money and achieving so much. But then when you watch deep interviews about a lot of them, they talk about the loneliness of being a YouTuber or loneliness of being an influencer. And I wonder, because a lot of people strive for that, but I wonder whether that's what's actually happening. Whether to an extent maybe this is an avoidant attachment sort of thing. It is this like it's me against everyone, and sort of like I'm deriving a lot of my achievement and success by sort of being shut off to the world and just showing the world what, I want to show them.
100%. And so, you touch on two very important concepts. So, number one, there's a big difference between self-indulgence and self-love. Having the fame, having the achievements can be self-indulgence without being self-love. Now, I think there are a lot of people that achieve great things from a healthy place. It's determinate. If you could have a million followers and be very secure in your identity and have a wonderful support system and not be lonely at all, and you can have a million followers
Yeah.
and not. So it's
Yeah.
it's not an exact determination, but there is an indulgence to, wow, look at me. I can edit my persona and only show the world the part that I want the world to see. And from that place, I get tons of accolades. And then all of what I perceive as negative, the days I don't have makeup on, the days I'm feeling a little chubby or whatever it may be, I hide that from the world. And so then it almost further alienates the person from true security and true love, because not only are they getting accolades for an edited version of themselves, there's also added shame to the hidden parts of themselves. And so it creates, I think, for the million followers that don't feel secure, I think they really don't feel secure. It's heightened, because we all have our insecurities. We all put our best foot forward when we can. But when you're literally showing the world all of your, you know, good points and hiding all of your bad points, it creates a bigger divide. So I think that's very, very important. But then the other major issue that you're hitting on is that we now have, at least in the West, a culture that does not foster secure attachment. We have a culture of, the breakdown of the nuclear family, widespread divorce, the mental illness epidemic is, highlighted. And so you have a lot of, untreated mental illness. It's kind of like I was saying earlier, the socially acceptable dysfunctional family. There's just sort of like a socially accepted dysfunction. And I think that can be good, because then there's at least freedom to name it and freedom to potentially, remedy what you can. But then there's also just that, well, everybody's dysfunctional. We're all crazy. I think I've heard, Prozac Nation, not to alienate anybody who's on Prozac, but it's like the statistics, like just be on drugs, just medicate your problem instead of, everybody has one, so just medicate it. And I know that there are a lot of people that use antidepressants and things like that as an aid, and, and they need to be on it. But when you have the statistics that we have here in the States, I think it highlights a bigger problem. And so we have this cultural environment that fosters
Right.
insecure attachment.
Yeah, that's pretty scary.
So even if you grew up in a healthy family that nurtured attachment, the culture may erode some of that health. So just like we were talking about, if you have insecure attachment, you can take steps to move towards secure attachment. The same is true if you grew up in a family that fostered secure attachment in your adult life, if you don't nurture that, you could lose it. You could, get wrapped up in some of the things of the culture or addiction. If you're dealing with addiction, you probably don't have the securest attachment. Um, and other mental illnesses and different factors can erode
Yeah. Yeah.
your healthy attachment, and we have a lot of that. So there's new statistics out that 2/3 of adults in the West now have some sort of attachment issue. Now that's not to say it's
Yeah.
as extreme as mine. Mine in the olden days was considered a disorder. Um, now you can have an attachment issue without having a
Mm.
totally
Yeah.
insecure attachment, if that makes sense. But it is believed that 2/3 of adults in the West have some sort
That's
of
really
attachment
scary
issue
to think
now.
about it. But actually, just to sort of add on to what you were saying
It,
earlier, because when you said that, just as we can reverse back to a secure attachment, we can also develop insecure attachments. Um, I wanted to ask,
yes.
can it also be something that can be triggered because of a work environment or because of a romantic relationship or because of a broken friendship that really impacted you? Because so far we've only really touched on, the childhood attachments that are formed by your parents. So talk to me a little bit about, what is it like? What kind of impact or other kinds of impact can leave on an individual to change from a secure to an insecure?
Sure. So, of course, trauma. So, if you're happily married and your spouse dies traumatically, that, of course, could alter your attachment. Or if your spouse, brutally mistreats you, or or if there's infidelity, um, all of those things can hinder healthy attachment. And then basically, the same can be said of a serious dating relationship. So if you're just dating someone casually, and maybe you've been on 4 dates, and then you find out that they're in a relationship with somebody else, of course that's not going to have the same effect as if you've been dating the person for 2 years. So if it's a significant betrayal, abuse, neglect in a significant relationship, then that, of course, can cause some issues. The other thing is just your own trauma. If you deal with your own illness, let's say you have an illness that, causes you to self isolate. And so then you're not nurturing, the relationships that support you the most. That could cause an issue. Or a separate trauma like losing a family member traumatically, anything that might cause you to shut down or not nurture your relationships can also eventually cause you to have damaged attachment. So of course, like, let's just, for example, you're very close to your father, and then totally unexpected your father dies of a massive heart attack, way younger than you thought he would. And let's say that you go through a grieving process for a few months and then gradually come back to, your supportive relationships. That's probably not going to cause an attachment issue. But if it's truly traumatic and you shut down and self-isolate for a year, 2 years, then naturally that is going to affect your relationships, and eventually affect
Right.
your attachment. And sometimes it can be good things. I mean, I hate to say it, but I would imagine that if I had triplets, my whole life would shut down. You know what I mean? And I would just be in survival mode, taking care of triplets. I mean, that's a huge handful, and so I might not nurture my friendships and some of my extended family relationships. And by the time the kids are in school, I might feel like completely detached from loving relationships. So it's not necessarily always a trauma or something bad, but it's usually
Right.
something extreme that disrupted your life and disrupted your ability to connect with others. um, Again, mental illness, postpartum depression, all of those things can cause you to not nurture yourself and your loving relationships, and eventually leave you feeling less
Very
than
interesting.
securely attached. My 20s were full of depression and anxiety, and just not productive dating. There's productive dating where you're, getting to know a person, they're getting to know you, you're vulnerable, you create a bond, you have a level of intimacy. Even if the relationship doesn't work out for the long term, it's still productive for the majority of the relationship. Because I was still very much so working through all of this attachment stuff and also suffering, working through depression and anxiety, my dating experiences in my 20s just added to the trauma. Not to be dramatic, but just strengthened my idea
Right.
of
100%.
self-protection, if that makes sense. And it wasn't actually abusive. Like, I was never in a domestic violence situation. It's just the
Right.
relationships weren't productive. There wasn't intimacy, there wasn't vulnerability. It was a broken version of myself trying to have connection and unfortunately attracting equally broken people. And so I, you know, was not improved by those relationships, and I also did damage to other people. Um, in those relationships, when I felt uncomfortable, I would break up with people. I would write off a guy very cruelly, that had invested some time and, had their own issues and maybe was worth, working some things out. I was very quick to say, hit the road, Jack.
Yeah.
See you later, alligator. You know. And so I'm sure I hurt some people along the way too. So those relationships were not productive. Um, and just further to your point, strengthened the insecure attachment.
So walk me through this marriage that you're in now, the relationship, how it started, how was this different? What was different about this one?
So I would say first and foremost, I had gotten really on the other side of my healing journey. So I, of course, thought, well, I'm going to get, and this is so funny for an avoidant attachment person who does tilt towards being a workaholic. I thought, I'm going to get past this attachment and then I'm going to know my purpose. I was never that person that said, I'm going to get past this attachment issue and then get married and have the white picket fence and 2.5 babies and a dog. I was not that person. I was more so striving to know my purpose and place in the world. And then as I, got healthier, I realized, okay, I need to, you know, reconnect with my dad's side of the family. Did that, great. Okay, what's my purpose? The next step was really creating my own support system of friends. Because I had friends, but I never truly relied on my friends as a support system to both give support and receive support. And so after, the odyssey of, going to Mexico and reconnecting with my family, I really started to develop just, a friend family, if that makes sense. Um, some, and the average person, who has a secure attachment, of course they have friends in elementary school and high school, but usually they develop, mature, adult, lasting relationships in the college years, usually, at college or in the college years. I didn't have that. Because of my insecure attachment, I didn't develop those. You don't really stay friends with people in your early years. Usually, I know there are exceptions. It's usually in college, and when my father died, and you hear people say that when I went through this major milestone, this person was there. This person was at my wedding, and those things happen in the 20s. Most people get married in their 20s, and so I didn't have that really strong support system. And so the first step was really, after reuniting with my family, was developing a support system. And it happened at first very much by my effort, and then very organically after I had, that sort of first couple of relationships. And I'm still in very close contact with all of those people. I mean, we do life together and really support and love each other. And then again, I was like, okay, what's my purpose? And then love. I always say I was interrupted by Grace because a church lady named Grace introduced me to my husband, and and she just thought we would be perfect together, and so she arranged sort of a picnic for her birthday, actually, and we met along with a bunch of other people, and we didn't
Oh,
like each other at first.
one of those romantic love stories. Those little rom-coms.
Yes.
Yeah.
Um, those little rom-coms. But we became friends because we were, relatively the same age, and we were attending the same church. Now, I wouldn't have probably met him if it weren't for Grace. We realized we were going to the same church and a relatively the same age, and he was looking for friends as well. So he was very receptive to friends, and I was very receptive to friends. And going back to my faith, you know, the way I commune with the Lord, I was aware that he was the person that God had for me. And I knew 5 months before my husband knew. For me, it was very, very real. For the next 5 months, got to see my future husband through the Lord's eyes. And so I every day would get some sort of truth about my husband's identity, about his purpose, about our future life together. And it was really a beautiful time. I really fell in love with my husband by seeing him from a higher perspective. And then right at the 5 month mark, he, said that he, was in love with me too, basically. And we got married very quickly. We got married, I think, 7 months later, I think is what it was. And it's just been he's the love of my life. It's been a crazy, crazy romance. We're now 3.5 years into our marriage, and the honeymoon is
Love
still
it.
going
I
on.
love
And
it.
people ask me, what is it? And it's like, well, you really need to see who your person is. I think a lot of times we get the butterflies and the feelings, and so we dive head first into a relationship. And I think that's one of the silver lining benefits of being avoidant is that you don't do that. You just don't do that. We fall in love slowly. And the benefit that can really hinder you from ever falling in love, but the benefit is, if you're, moving towards health, is that you really get to know the person for who they are, not for what they can do for you, not for the needs that they can meet in you, but for who they are.
No, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. Look, we are reaching the end of the interview, so I just want to ask you one or two more questions. The first one is because I'm sure a lot
Okay.
of people listening to this are probably like trying to connect dots and trying to figure out like, okay, which one do I connect with?
Uh-huh.
Which one do I?
Yeah.
So you did mention that therapy is one of the very, very important sort of like things that we can take going forward. Um, are there any particular kind of relationships or friendships that we can seek out to help us not only like know ourselves better, but also to develop more of a secure kind of relationship or secure kind of attachment style?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, if you have an insecure attachment style, you're going to heal more by being in relationships, and that includes friendships, with people that have a secure attachment style. And I almost hate to say that out loud because when you have an insecure attachment style, you naturally are drawn to and connect with people with an insecure attachment style.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So it's, I think most counselors will say the level of brokenness that we have, we attract. And so the very thing that you need is going to be counterintuitive. So let's say you go to a party, and there is someone who is very balanced and who asks you questions and also shares, you know, you may feel a little intimidated by that, and then start another conversation with somebody who's like, oh my god, I'm having the worst day ever, and just like pour out their life story and never lets you get a word in edgewise, yet it's charismatic and you're drawn to it. Chances are, if you're trying to deal with attachment, you need to seek a friendship with the first person, not the second person.
Right.
Does that make sense? So it's, we want people that want a secure attachment need more people in their lives with a healthier,
Right.
secure attachment style. but it's not going to be who you're
Right.
naturally drawn to most likely.
What that means is then a person that has secure attachment style has to also be attracted to a person with an insecure attachment style for that to
Yeah.
work in a way.
Yeah.
But I would assume that a person with a secure
Right.
attachment style
And
would naturally draw another secure attachment style individual, right? So,
yes. Yeah. And so that's the rub. That's the difficulty is they may see
right.
red flags in you and not want to foster that relationship. But that's why
Yeah.
it starts with counseling and self-awareness and some of the individual work first. So the idea is that hopefully you've had some level of healing. And so even though you're
Right.
not in the fullness of your healing, you're healthy enough to consciously
Mm.
attract healthier
Yeah.
people. Not naturally, but consciously. And and self-regulate and say, "Wow, this person's very balanced.
Right.
Let me try to also be balanced." Not for the other person,
Mm.
but for yourself. And yet it will foster a
I
healthier
like that.
environment for a healthier friendship. And
Yeah.
that's really hard at first.
Yeah.
That's really hard at first. And it's even harder in dating because you want to be with the person you're naturally attracted to,
Right.
not the person
Yeah.
you're consciously attracted to. So I think it's, again, I didn't know this at the time, but I think it's really beautiful that I
Mm.
started with family, then
Right.
friends, and then romance. And that's really the blueprint. That's
Yeah.
really the blueprint that you want to follow. I didn't know it
Yeah.
at the time; it just kind of naturally happened. But yeah, you want to seek out those people that are more balanced and have
Yeah.
a more secure attachment style. The unfortunate thing is often avoidance attract anxious, and so you think you're going to balance each other out, but really you just drive each other
Mm.
further into your own lane. So, the the avoidant is going to be somewhat stoic, and the anxious on some level knows that they need that they really need to develop a level of that in themselves, but they see it in another person, and so they're like, let me
Mm.
glean some of that. The avoidant says no, but is refreshed by the anxious's ability to move past their boundaries. And so that's why they initially attract to each other. But really, at the end, the anxious feels like the stoicism of the avoidant is unloving and unsupportive, and the avoidant
Mm.
feels violated by the breaches in their boundaries. So it really pushes each into their own lane. But at first, it seems like, oh well, this person's balancing me out. You would be better to seek out someone with a secure attachment. And there's a learning curve. I mean, there's definitely a learning curve.
What can parents that have probably, that knowing that their child when they were very, very young probably had gone through a trauma, maybe another parent passed away, or they'd experienced a divorce, and obviously now I can't undo the sort of trauma my kid has gone through, and fast forward, my kid is already 10, 11, and I'm seeing little signs in my child. What can a parent do in those situations to kind of reverse that?
That's a fabulous question. And I have to give credit to my mom, even though she's in that big
Yeah.
socially acceptable dysfunctional family. She she very much saw those characteristics in me and got me in counseling when I was like 13 or 14 years old. So I do think counseling, children's counseling is so important, and I'm so grateful that I was exposed to that. But not everybody is willing or able to do that. So you want to just reaffirm a foundation of love. And so oftentimes the child dealing with an unhealthy attachment style is going to act out or withdraw and not engage. And so it's important that the adult that's trying to bring healing doesn't react doesn't react to the child's outbursts and doesn't take personally the child's withdrawal. They have to just continually stand on a firm foundation of love. even though you're withdrawing right now, it's okay. I understand. I love you. Even though you're acting out right now, it's okay. I understand. I love you. Love is not based on their response. It's based on a foundation that you establish. And that is extremely difficult. And we all need to support our fostering parents and our adoptive parents, because statistically, they're the parents that are going to deal with this the most. And it is a labor of love to not react. And just also as a parent, I'm a stepmom now, and I absolutely love being a stepmom, and I love my stepdaughter unconditionally. But we're humans, and it's easier for us to give and receive love when the love that we give out is received well. And that's basically the cautionary tale of dealing with somebody with an insecure attachment style, is that they don't receive love well. And so you could shower them with love and they could be uncomfortable and retreat or even push you away. Or you could shower someone with love and they could say, it's not enough. Your efforts are not enough. I need you to do more. Well, that's discouraging, But you have to operate from that foundation of love. I love this child because I choose to love this child, not because of the way that they reciprocate. And I think that is huge, and it has to be consistent. It cannot be when you're having a good day, 50% of the time. I mean, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be the majority of the time to really allow an environment for the child to
I love that.
heal.
Oh, that's amazing. There's so many useful tips that you've just given us today. I think, people of all ages, younger, older, whatever it is, wherever stage you are in life, I think there's so much that you can take away.
Thank you so much. I truly enjoyed this, and I love your questions. Your questions really drew out some information that I wanted to get out there, so thank you so much.
If you enjoyed the episode and would like to help support the show, please follow and subscribe. You can rate and review your feedback on any of our platforms listed in the description. I'd like to recognize our guests who are vulnerable and open to share their life experiences with us. Thank you for showing us we're human. Also, a thank you to our team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make it happen.
Chris Trzynski, Stefan Menzel.
The show would be nothing without you. I'm Jenica, host and writer of the show, and you're listening to Multispective.